The wind over the flatlands of western Missouri had a personality. Most days it was a friend, drying laundry on the line and keeping the summer heat from settling too heavy. But for the last 6 days, ever since the storm, it had been a thief. It snuck under the edges of the big blue tarp Eleanor Vance had wrestled over the gaping hole in her barn roof, trying to pry it loose to steal what little protection she'd managed to put in place. Eleanor, perched precariously on a ladder braced against the weathered siding, gave the nail another solid whack. The hammer felt good in her hand, a familiar weight. It had been Frank's hammer. Now, like the farm and the debt and the stubborn ache in her lower back, it was hers. She was 63, a widow for 2 years, and she was not the type of woman to ask for help. Not when the church ladies brought casseroles after the funeral, and not now, when half her barn was open to the sky. She squinted at the damage. The tornado hadn't touched down, thank God, but the winds that spun off it had been furious. They'd peeled back a 30-foot section of the corrugated tin roof as if it were a sardine can, splintering the old rafters beneath. The insurance man had come and gone, a slick fellow from Jefferson City with a clipboard and a sympathetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. He'd used words like depreciation and pre-existing structural deficiencies and act of God. The check he'd finally offered wouldn't cover the cost of the lumber, let alone the labor. So, it was just her and Frank's hammer. She'd spent the last 2 days dragging the twisted sheets of metal to the scrap pile and the last 4 trying to secure a tarp that was big enough to be a sail on a clipper ship. Every gust threatened to send her and the ladder tumbling to the hard-packed dirt below. It was a fool's errand, and she knew it, but doing something, anything, felt better than sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a quote from a roofing company that might as well have been written in a foreign language. The silence of the farm, once a comfort, now felt like an accomplice to her struggle, pressing in on all sides. She hammered another nail, the sharp sound swallowed by the vast, indifferent sky. It was just another problem to be solved. Alone. It had been a different kind of sky 6 nights ago. Not indifferent, but angry. It had boiled up from the southwest, the color of a fresh bruise, a sickly, greenish yellow that anyone who'd lived in Missouri for more than a season knew to respect. The tornado sirens had started their mournful rising and falling wail in Sedalia, 10 miles east, the sound faint and distorted by the time it reached her property line. Eleanor had been securing the chickens in their coop, her eyes on the roiling cloud base, when she heard a new sound. It wasn't the wind, not yet. It was a low, guttural rumble, a man-made thunder that grew steadily louder, coming right down her county road. She straightened up, wiping a strand of graying hair from her forehead with the back of a gloved hand. Headlights, dozens of them, cut through the deepening twilight. They weren't cars or tractors. They were motorcycles. A long, disciplined column of them turned into her gravel driveway, the crunch of their tires a stark contrast to the thrum of their engines. They stopped a respectful distance from the house, forming a semicircle of chrome and leather in her yard. For a moment, she felt a prickle of fear. A lone woman, miles from the nearest neighbor. But fear wasn't a luxury she could afford. She pulled off her work gloves, tucked them into the back pocket of her jeans, and walked onto the porch as a single rider detached from the group. He was a big man, built like the oak trees that lined the drive. His beard was thick and gray-streaked, his face a road map of wind and sun. He wore a leather vest covered in patches, but she didn't bother trying to read them. He stopped at the bottom of her porch steps, took off his sunglasses, and looked at her directly. His eyes weren't mean. They were just tired. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low gravel that matched his engine. "Name's Bear. We saw the warning on our phones. Nearest overpass is 5 miles back, and this looks like it's coming on fast. We need to get out of the wind. Your barn there." He nodded toward the big red structure. "It looks solid." It wasn't a demand. It was a simple statement of fact, a request from one practical person to another. Eleanor looked past him at the others. Men and women of all ages sitting on their bikes watching her. They looked like they'd been riding all day. They looked like people who just wanted to be safe. She thought of Frank, who always said you judge a person by what they do, not what they wear. "It's solid enough," she said, her voice plain and steady. "West doors are unlocked. They're heavy, but they'll hold. Get your bikes in there. There's room." The man, Bear, just nodded once. A silent signal passed through the group. Engines were cut, and a strange quiet fell, broken only by the rising wind and the murmur of voices. They began wheeling their heavy machines, one by one, into the cavernous space of the barn. Eleanor watched from the porch. No one was loud. No one was careless. They moved with a practiced efficiency. She went inside, put on a pot of coffee, the big percolator she only used for church functions, and found a box of oatmeal cookies in the pantry. When she came back out with a tray, they were all inside, the massive barn doors groaning shut against the first real blasts of wind. She walked over and pushed one of the smaller side doors open. The smell of rain, engine oil, and damp leather met her. Bear was standing just inside. "You don't have to do that, ma'am," he said, looking at the steaming mugs and the cookies. "Didn't say I had to," Eleanor replied, setting the tray on a workbench. "Coffee's hot. Help yourselves." She didn't linger. She didn't ask their names, or where they were from, or what the patches on their vests meant. They were people caught in a storm, and she had a barn. The transaction was that simple. She went back to her house, watched the rain lash against the windows, and listened to the storm rage. She fell asleep in her armchair, and when she woke just before dawn, the world was washed clean and eerily quiet. The motorcycles were gone. On the porch railing, next to where she'd left the empty coffee pot, was a neatly folded $20 bill, held down by a small, smooth stone. She picked it up, unfolded it, and looked at it for a long moment before taking it inside and leaving it on the kitchen counter. It felt less like a payment and more like a misunderstanding. Now, 6 days later, that $20 was still on the counter, a silent testament to a debt she never asked for. Her arms ached from swinging the hammer. The tarp flapped mockingly in the breeze, one of the corner grommets having torn clean through. She let out a long, frustrated sigh. The job was too big. The truth of it settled on her not with a crash, but with a slow, heavy resignation. She couldn't do this alone. For the first time, looking at the ruined roof and the stack of bills on her desk, Eleanor Vance felt the cold, sharp edge of despair. She was about to lose the farm, not to the bank, not to a developer, but to a spring storm and a stubborn refusal to admit defeat. She finally climbed down the ladder, her knees protesting, and stood in the yard, hands on her hips, staring up at the symbol of her failure. That's when she heard it. The sound started as a faint vibration in the soles of her worn work boots, a distant hum on the edge of hearing. It was the same sound from the night of the storm, a deep, rolling thunder that wasn't coming from the sky. Her first thought, a reflexive flicker of anxiety, was that another storm was brewing, but the sky was a perfect, cloudless blue. The sound grew, resolving itself into the unmistakable chorus of V-twin engines. Many of them. She walked to the end of her driveway, her heart beating a little faster. Over the rise in the county road they appeared. First one, then two, then a dozen, then a flood. A river of chrome and polished steel poured into view, sunlight glinting off handlebars and helmets. They moved with the same disciplined grace as before, but this was not a small group seeking shelter. This was an army. Eleanor stood frozen as the procession turned into her drive. They didn't stop by the house. They flowed past, bike after bike, filling the pasture she'd cleared last week. They parked in long, impossibly neat rows, the sound of their idling engines a symphony of controlled power. She counted, at first, then lost track somewhere after 100. It had to be 300 motorcycles, maybe more. From the front of the column, Bear swung his leg over his bike. He walked toward her, his expression as unreadable as it had been 6 nights ago. Eleanor's mind raced. What was this? A thank you? It seemed excessive. A threat? It didn't feel threatening. It felt organized. He stopped a few feet from her. He was even bigger in the daylight. He looked at her, then his gaze shifted, lifting to the tattered blue tarp on the barn roof. He looked back at her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes beyond exhaustion. It was a kind of quiet resolve. Heard your roof had a bad night, he said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor was speechless. She could only nod, her throat suddenly tight. Figured, he said. He turned his head and gave a short, sharp nod to the assembled riders. And then, the most incredible thing happened. It was like watching a well-drilled military unit mobilize. As if on a silent command, riders dismounted. From the back of the procession, 2 large flatbed trucks rumbled up the drive, laden with stacks of fresh lumber, bundles of shingles, boxes of nails, and generators. Men and women moved with purpose, grabbing tool belts, circular saws, and nail guns. A command structure she couldn't see was clearly in place. A team of men headed for the barn with pry bars and began tearing away the damaged rafters and the flapping tarp. Another group set up saws on sawhorses, the buzz and whine filling the air. A third group began organizing materials. Eleanor just stood there, a statue in her own front yard. A woman with a long, gray braid and kind eyes walked over, holding out a steaming styrofoam cup. Thought you might need this, she said gently. We brought our own coffee this time. Eleanor took the cup, her fingers numb. I don't understand, she stammered, looking from the woman to the whirlwind of activity at her barn. The woman smiled. Last week, you opened your barn to a few of our brothers and sisters. No questions, no charge. You gave us shelter. That was the West Regional chapter on their way to a rally. Word got back. She gestured with her head toward the swarm of people. This is the state chapter, and some folks from Kansas and Arkansas chapters who were close by. Bear put the word out this morning. Said a friend needed a hand. A friend. The word echoed in Eleanor's head. She had given them a dry place to wait out a storm for a few hours. And in return, this. She spent the day in a daze, watching them work. It was a marvel of efficiency. They swarmed the roof, a dozen men moving in sync, their hammers rising and falling in a steady, percussive rhythm. Damaged timbers were torn out and replaced. New decking was laid down. Tar paper was rolled out and stapled into place. Shingles were carried up and laid in perfect overlapping lines. No one shouted. No one wasted emotion. Down on the ground, women had set up tables and were making sandwiches, handing out bottles of water, keeping the workforce fueled. They offered her food and drink, treating her with a quiet, profound respect, as if she were the guest of honor at a party She didn't know she was hosting. She tried to help, to carry something, but they would gently take it from her hands and direct her back to a lawn chair someone had set up for her in the shade. Her only job, it seemed, was to watch. By late afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the last shingle was nailed into place. The roof wasn't just patched, it was entirely new, solid and strong. The dark gray shingles a handsome cap on her old red barn. It was better than it had ever been. The cleanup was just as swift. Every scrap of old wood, every twisted piece of tin, every stray nail was gathered and loaded onto one of the trucks. They swept the barn floor. They raked the yard where they'd been working. By the time the sun touched the treetops, it was as if they had never been there, save for the magnificent new roof. The engines began to rumble to life again. Bear walked over to her one last time. He stood before her on the porch, the setting sun casting a long shadow behind him. "Should hold," he said, nodding toward the barn. Eleanor finally found her voice. "I don't know how to thank you. I can't pay for this." He met her gaze, his expression unwavering. He reached into the pocket of his leather vest and pulled something out. It was the $20 bill she had left on her kitchen counter. He gently tucked it into the pocket of her flannel shirt. "Account square, ma'am," he said, his voice softer now. "We don't pay for shelter when a storm's coming. And we don't let our friends fix their roofs alone." He turned, without another word, walked back to his motorcycle and swung his leg over. With a final, collective roar that shook the very ground beneath her feet, the column of bikes began to move. They filed out of her pasture, down her gravel drive and back onto the county road, a retreating tide of goodwill and horsepower. Eleanor Vance stood on her porch and watched until the last taillight disappeared over the horizon. The sun was down, and the familiar silence of the farm returned. But tonight, it wasn't an oppressive silence. It was peaceful. She looked at her barn, its new roof a dark, strong silhouette against the twilight sky. Then, she looked down at the $20 bill in her shirt pocket. A kindness given without thought had been returned 100-fold. A debt paid not with money, but with hammers and hands, and a code she was only just beginning to understand. The wind picked up again, but this time it just sounded like a whisper.